Salutations. Welcome to the May 2023 luncheon of the Democratic 23rd Century Club. Really glad you guys all showed up today. I especially want to thank all of you for abiding by and helping us give a correct head count to the restaurant by registering no later than yesterday at 4 o'clock. That's a huge help. It really is. So thank you, and we appreciate your doing. And by the way, if you should wake up some Friday morning and all of a sudden decide, you know what, I'm going to go to that luncheon, come anyway. But if you can register by 4 o'clock the previous day, no later than that, really help to speak in. Okay, let's see. If you haven't already renewed your membership, we're on a calendar year, so please do. You get a variety of benefits, possibly the greatest of which is if we help maintain the permanent Democratic headquarters that we're on board for the admin. That's covered by raising debt growth, so your dues are being well spent. Could I have my e-board members to raise their hand? They're all our volunteers that help keep the club running smoothly and take care of all the behind the scenes things. I want to just remind our e-board members that our next board meeting is next Wednesday, the Wednesday following the luncheon at noon by Zoom, as usual. Okay, let's see. Oh, and of course, do we have any elected officials with us today? Please. Yes. Well, introduce yourself, please.
My name is Vicki Baker, and I'm a city council
You're elected officials. Don't be shy. Shy people go unacknowledged. Elected officials are not shy. And of course, no meeting would be complete without our Santa Clara County Democratic Party Chair, Bill James. Today's speaker, I'm really excited just reading this little word here. It's Professor Chad Raphael at the University of Santa Clara. He is a scholar of, I love this title, the scholar of political and environmental communication. Professor in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Santa Clara. He will be talking to us today about the challenges of vetting candidates and holding elected officials accountable when disinvestment in local journalism has diminished the news media's traditional role as a supportive state. And then the part that I'm most interested in is the part where he's going to talk about a number of steps that we might take to fix this. So please give a warm welcome to Professor Chad Raphael.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it. Nope. Let me take it out. How's that? Better? That's good. So I want to start with some naive questions. How did a guy like this win an election? Sure, we can blame the Republican Party on Long Island for not vetting the candidate. Maybe we can ask why the Democratic Party and his Democratic opponents didn't do opposition research on it. But wasn't there somebody else who was supposed to protect democracy from people like George Soros? Yeah. Might be forgiven for asking, how the local news media failed to spot a fugitive from justice in Brazil with a fake resume, not just one line, but pretty much all of it. Not in his first campaign, but in his second. And not for local dog catcher, but for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. In an affluent district, I might add. And not out in the middle of nowhere, but adjacent to one of the greatest media capitals in the entire world. From the North Shore Leader, a weekly paper with a very small circulation, was the only news organization that cast doubt on George Santos's claims. And by the way, they did it in a brief editorial, grudgingly endorsing his Democratic opponent, published just 3 weeks before Election Day. Actually, we have an answer to that one. It's because they got a bunch of tips from local residents that his story didn't check out. They didn't initiate the investigation. Most importantly, what does all that say about the state of local news in the US today? It's a question that I want to answer. And so we're going to start with this problem of disinvestment in local news. So let's begin there. If you look at a map of the United States, and you look at what's happened to newspapers since 2004, about a quarter of them have disappeared. More than 2,100 newspapers. The orange dots here are weekly papers. The dailies are in blue. So we've lost a quarter of our newspapers since 2004. And you can see that the distribution is not equal. There are certain parts of the country that have especially lost more outlets than others. Mostly print, okay? Because here the question is, well, what about all those wonderful online digital websites, news sites that have been created? Have they filled the void? The answer is no. Well, we lost 2,100 newspapers. We gained only about 500 local or state digital news sites to fill that void. And if you can look at two maps, you can see that they're not necessarily in the same places. Take a look at the Nebraska campus, right in the middle of that map, right? Look at how many local papers disappeared. And look at how many digital sites, news sites, replaced them. What has filled the void, in part, are some pay-for-play networks that operate political websites that are designed to look like local and state news organizations. So one of them is a nationwide network of 1,300 local sites that publishes coverage that is ordered up by Republican PACs and candidates and corporate PR firms working for them. You can see the North Cook News and the DuPage Policy Journal, which stunningly had exactly the same pictures and headlines on the front page the same day. You can look at the September 11th, 2020 homepage of the Illinois Valley Times, one of these sites, in which almost every single story on the homepage is about the same Republican state senator. She must have done important stuff that week. Either that or her supporters paid the organization that runs this website to, punch her in every single story. This network that I've been talking about, you can see the number of sites they operate across the country. The blue ones are ones that are designed to look like local news organizations, and the green ones are designed like state news organizations. And you can see there are certain places where they especially have created them, and that some of them have a particularly large footprints, those are larger things. So a lot of people are going to these sites and thinking that they're getting local news from an independent news organization. Public broadcasting, has that filled the void? Is that the answer? Not really. We do have a wonderful public broadcasting network in this country, given the tiny amount of funding we give it compared to other democracies, developed democracies as well. But about half of those 1,400 public broadcasting stations produce absolutely no original content. They are essentially retransmission antennae for national programming produced by NPR or what have you. So we have a lot of people who live in news deserts these days. 200 counties don't have a local newspaper anymore. Half of all counties have only one newspaper. Usually that's a weekly, not a daily. And you can see in red the counties that have no newspapers, and in orange or ones that have one newspaper. And you can see that there are particular parts of the country. And if you look at them, you kind of know which way they tend to vote. These folks are not well informed about local news. And imagine that, an entire county, an entire Santa Clara County, Santa Clara County, with no newspaper. Who's watching the story? And I want to say that this has been a story of disinvestment, most of all. I'll explain why this has happened. First of all, disinvestment by advertisers. As you probably know, advertisers have shifted what used to be the bread and butter of local newspapers, which was classified advertising, to the internet, and they've gone to create more targeted ads to reach smaller and smaller demographic slices and put those on social media. And many have abandoned the local newspapers that they used to support. Back in the old days when newspapers were in their heyday, 80% of the newspaper's revenue was from advertising, only 20% was from subscriptions. So thanks for the soundtrack. So we're picking it up, it's getting more exciting here. So think about that, who really were the customers of local newspapers? They were advertisers. The audience was 20% of the revenues. And then it's also been a failure to invest by search engines and social media, which aggregate news without compensating news organizations that produce that news at all. And then finally, there's been a disinvestment by media owners themselves. As these local news organizations have been sold off as distressed properties to vultures who come in and buy them up, which typically tend to be big national chains, but mostly hedge funds and private equity funds. They've come in and absolutely slashed newsrooms, just laid off journalist after journalist, so that they're operating these kind of bare bones news organizations and relying more and more on National Water Service stories rather than locally generated. Here's what doesn't explain this very well. It's not the public's fault. There hasn't been declining demand in local news. The public didn't first lose interest in local news, and therefore the market responded. Although that may be an effect, as people lose their local news organizations, more of them have to turn to national news. And so they may be learning to be less interested in local news. This is a market failure. The markets for advertising and the markets for news are abysmally failing to meet public demand for local news. And that's really troubling because local news is a public good. It's like education. It's something that everyone benefits from, even if they don't consume it directly. Because in a well-educated society, you can have a stronger economy, more diverse economy, and in a well-informed society, you're going to have a stronger democracy because people know what kind of policies are. They know which ones, so they can make an informed decision about which ones to support and which candidates to support. Less likely to fall prey to misinformation and demagoguery. So what are the dangers for democracy of this decline in local news? First, you have to remember some of the different kinds of owners. They pose different kinds of threats to democracy. So you've got the independent media owners. These are privately held companies or companies that might be publicly traded, but the voting stock, the controlling stock is really controlled by a very small group, usually a family. And then you have national and regional chains. So Sinclair Broadcast Group would be an example of that. They own lots and lots of TV and radio stations across the country. They tend to be conservative news on the air. National and regional chains. These are chains that own multiple newspapers or broadcast stations. Again, that which owns USA Today and lots of other newspapers would be an example of that. And you got your cross media owners. These are folks who own both print and broadcast news outlets, sometimes in the same market, like the Tribune Company, which for many years ran the Chicago Tribune and WGN TV. And then you've got conglomerates for whom news is a very small part of their overall portfolio of companies, which include a lot of non-media companies. Disney being an example. Think of it like Disney owned. Historically, regulators were worried about threats to democracy posed by these different kinds of corporations. They worried about the independent owners' influence of the owners' partisan views on news. And so they developed some regulations to try to check that. They were worried about chain owners having the effect of homogenizing news and voices, columnists, for example, across lots and lots of local media outlets, because that's a way to practice economies of scale. They worry about cross-media owners harming the diversity of views in a local market if they own the dominant TV and radio station. So we used to have regulations that pretty strictly forbid that. And then they worry about conglomerate non-media interests that might influence news coverage. I don't know if you ever watched Good Morning America, for example, which is kind of sort of news adjacent, right? You could make quite drinking games and use coffee, right? You can make quite a drinking ban out of counting the number of times they promoted Disney products. Latest opening of Disney Aladdin on Broadway, right? Even in a story about the Indian festival of Diwali, Aladdin is not, Aladdin, Diwali, about it close enough. And then more recent research is showing that we should be particularly concerned about the impacts of these kinds of owners as well. Research is showing that publicly traded companies, which are very driven by profit maximization quarter to quarter, tend to produce more sensational and negative news because that's what you can get people to click on fast. More eyeballs to advertisers. The hedge funds and the private equity funds, research is showing that they produce less reporting because they fired so many journalists. And concentrated parent companies where control is concentrated in a handful of hands tend to exert more ideological influence by the owners than companies where diverse shareholders control the voting. You have your examples. So you're looking at USANA, the Mercury News, owned by the Golden Globe Capital Fund, which has absolutely gutted it. Anybody remember getting the Mercury News on paper back in the 1990s and how it went thud on your doorstep? And when you picked it up, you picked something up. I don't know if anybody still gets the Mercury News on paper. What's it like picking that up? Yeah, it's like picking up the mail, on a slow day. Yeah, pretty incredible. That used to be a really great regional newspaper. It was winning Pulitzer Prizes. It was the envy of many other regional papers that were owned by Knight Ridder before Knight Ridder took the shelves. Other dangers for democracy. If we had a stronger public service media system in this country, we might not need to worry as much about commercial media, but we don't. Public service media in the US still remains fairly small compared to other developed democracies. And it's increasingly reliant on donors and grants from us, fairly small group of funders. And that's probably because public service media does a much better job than commercial media at covering real news. And we know this from research. We know from comparative studies that in commercial media, compared with commercial media, public service media around the world not only provide more news versus entertainment, they provide more hard news about politics and economics versus soft news, infotainment. And they also provide more international news, including those kind of local stories that help people in one community, local community, understand how their community is being affected by things that are happening halfway around the world, and vice versa. Like, what are the drivers of immigration, for example, to your local community in the United States? What are the different economic and political crises that are happening in different countries and regions in Latin America that are driving immigration to the United States? Every fall, when I teach a course on news and democracy, I have my students do a content analysis in class. It takes less than a minute. I ask them to compare some public service and commercial news organizations. We choose different ones every year, and we always end up with the same story. So some years we compare USA Today to NPR, two national news organizations, one commercial, one public service. Some years we compare KQED with the Mercury News, or with NBC Bay Area, a couple of commercial, commercial opinions. And every year we find that the public service broadcaster produces more hard news, less soft news typically, more international news. And typically it's more prominent in their home pages as well. So every year, same test, and the students see that's right in front of their eyes. We added up and showed. I mentioned that we have some pretty weak public service regulations, not just regulations on private media in the United States. So I'm familiar with a lot of this, so I'll be pretty quick here. But in the US, we have no obligation, there's no obligation for the media to provide partial and balanced coverage of diversities anymore. The Fairness Doctrine, which used to require that, it's, pro forma, went away in the 1980s. Whereas in other major democracies, public media have to provide impartial and balanced coverage of diversity. In the US, there's no obligation for the media to provide free airtime to candidates of political parties during elections, whereas in most of Europe, all broadcasters, private and public service media, to provide that free airtime. And we have no requirements that, therefore we require parties and candidates to raise and spend millions of dollars on TV and radio ads to see whether they can communicate with the public, rather than spending that money on local party building. And that increases donors' influence over politics. Whereas in Europe, there's more money freed up for local party building activity. Given the news system that we have, it's not surprising that Americans know less about news than residents of other Western democracies, and they know especially less about hard news and international news. And more recent research done in the last 10 years is beginning to show us what happens in places where the local news media go away, where there are no or few local news sources. From studies that have been done in the last decade, we know that at the local level, these news deserts have less competitive local elections, fewer people running against each other, and more incumbency advantage. We know that at the state level, there are higher reports on corruption indexes in states where there are very few local and state level news organizations. At the level of U.S. House seats, representatives are, this is just incredible, this correlation. Representatives who come from news desert locations, districts, are less likely to bring money and benefits into their district, less likely to participate actively in hearings, and less likely to serve on district relevant committees. There's no accountability. So there's no incentive for them to work hard, less incentive for them to work hard to their constituents. And when we look at those citizens, those voters in those places, they're less attentive to and knowledgeable about politics, and they're also less likely to vote. So local news correlates with a lot of bad things, loss of political accountability and loss of political participation. We also have to remember that there's a really important intermediary role for news. It's just about, it's not just there for leaders to communicate to the public. It's for the public to be able to communicate back to their leaders about what they want, what they're experiencing. When you lose a local news organization, you lose that channel from the public to their leaders. It's one of the reasons why a lot of news organizations didn't see the support for Donald Trump through support the 2016 election. And then this loss of local news media is also probably contributing to political polarization. As local news declines, audiences have to turn to national news organizations, which is all they have left. And those national news organizations, as you know, are much more likely to think issues in partisan terms, as a story of us versus them, and to present anyone who's trying to work across the aisle as traitors, rather than as effective politicians who are trying to get things done. So I don't want to leave you there. I don't want to spoil anybody's dessert. There is dessert. I want to talk about what are some possible, hopeful ways of providing local news. And to do that, we have to kind of remind ourselves of all the different roles that we want the news to play in our democracy. So people who've been writing about this for 500 years or so, like John Milton and Ariel Pacific and all that sort of stuff, they tend to focus on four different things that they want the news media to do. And one is to provide high quality political information so that people can inform voters and judge policies and candidates effectively. Another is to provide a vibrant forum for debate, which has diverse views, so that people can be exposed to different points of view and arguments. Third is to be a watchdog on the powerful, to hold political leaders and major institutions accountable for their performance. And then fourth is to be a voice of the people that speaks back to our leaders and tells them through polling and focus groups and lots of other ways what sort of experiences we're having and what we think ought to be done. When the news media don't play these roles, you get these kinds of dysfunctional roles. The news media become organs for political misinformation. They exclude ideas from debate. They become a mouthpiece of the powerful, and they amplify harmful voices, which we've seen a lot of in the last 6-7 years. So one of the most important things we can do, given the impact of financing on the news, the quality of the news, is to provide bigger, more stable funding and technical assistance to nonprofit local news organizations. That solves a lot of problems. The nice thing is there's growing demand for this kind of news, even through the pandemic. In fact, especially through the pandemic, people were driven away from kind of low quality local news towards high quality organizations that they felt they could trust to know how to survive the pandemic. We can fund technical assistance providers to the nonprofit sector, like Institute for Nonprofit News and Internews, which are these amazing organizations that teach someone who's never run a news organization how to do that. We can pass the Journalism Competition Preservation Act, which would require Google and Facebook and others to compensate local news outlets for using their news content. All of this would give us more substantive information, provide a more rational forum for debate, and often helps the only remaining voice of the people and the only remaining watchdog on power. One example is the New Jersey Civic Information Consortium. New Jersey passed a law almost 5 years ago now to create this consortium, which is funded by public money and provides grants to improve the quantity and quality of civic information, particularly in underserved communities where there's not enough local news being produced now. They also provide residents with direct access to government information and public data. So you don't only have to rely on news media. And they train community members, including students and professionals, how to contribute to the news media by doing their own journalism and media production. And often that's working with a news organization, not necessarily on their own. And then they do research and spread good ideas. How about California ballot initiative to create something like this? While we're at it, what about a California ballot initiative to create a dedicated funding stream for nonprofit local news organizations that have a public service mission? Why not treat news as a public utility, a public good, and fund it the way you would fund a public good for tax dollars? Another really important thing you can do is practice greater diversity, equity, and inclusion in journalism. Local newsrooms have really made very slow progress. Some have made none at all in diversifying their own staffs in order to better reflect their communities, represent them, and regain their trust, because many communities, these organizations have lost the trust because of their past reporting. And that has a lot of things. This critical journalism wheel, which you could come easily by searching the internet. Look at how many different ideas there are. And if you put that in one of those links, you'll get like 3 or 4 or 5 ideas about what you can do to feel where you increase the kind of journalism. The broad things we need to do, we need to train and hire more diverse journalists. We need to change how the news media choose stories, what sources they turn to, and not just the usual suspects, and how they frame those stories in order to be more responsive and inclusive. And if we do that, we'll get better political information. We'll get a more inclusive voice of the people and a broader and better forum for debate. Remember, DEI doesn't just focus on race and ethnicity. Usually what people go to first, but it's really important. But it also includes nationality and gender and sexual orientation and mental ability and language and income and a lot more. Remember when Metro newspapers had labor reporters? I do. Santa Clara Spotlight has one, by the way. Publishes stories like this. I hear that Santa Clara Spotlight, a nonprofit local news organization, almost lost this reporter until some faithful readers stepped in and said, no, get rid of that. That's really important. You need to keep that. And it is important because the beat system is so influential in the news that we get. When a news organization decides to define a certain number of beats along a certain number of topics and assign reporters to them, it's creating predictable flows of news about those topics. And so when a beat goes away, like the labor beat has at many places, those stories go away. To give you an example, one of my first jobs when I graduated from college in the late 80s, early 90s, was with the Hotel Workers Union, Local 26 in Boston, Massachusetts. And the head of that union was very, very good at pitching stories to the news media. He had a great media sense. It helped that there was a labor reporter at the Boston Herald, which was this little Rupert Murdoch-owned, right-wing populist tabloid, but they had a labor reporter. And so, for example, when one of the hotel owners decided that it would be a really good selling point for his hotel to tell his guests that a housekeeper had cleaned their bathroom floor on her hands and knees with a scrub brush, he instituted this policy. Our union was able to get that story on the front page of the Boston Herald, this little conservative picture paper, with a picture of a 65-year-old woman bent down on her hands and knees, grimacing and sweating, scrubbing the floor with a scrub brush. And talking, housekeepers talking about, it wasn't just the physical pain of doing this, it was the humiliation of having to get down on your hands and knees to do a job that you can do just as well with a mom, with a privileged attachment. And knowing that a hotel owner who had never cleaned a bathroom floor in his life had decided that this little fantasy of submission and nomination is something that they were going to need to participate in to attract hotel guests. Needless to say, as soon as this thing got published, the hotel owner realized maybe this is not the best marketing strategy. And that was out the door. Rupert Murdoch picture paper, labor reporter. That's the key. Right? Those stories go away when we use like the labor. And maybe so do these kinds of stories about occupational safety and health limits, the toxic exposure that have caused trauma to Silicon Valley workers and workers in electronics production around the world. They're still causing harm. One way to support the DEI in journalism is to support the ethnic media. There's a vibrant ethnic media in this country. About 1,000 outlets across the country providing news to some of the least well-served communities of the mainstream news media. A lot of them are Spanish language, but there's some diversity. And so supporting nonprofit examples. I mean, think about the importance of the Black press in American history, right? Fighting for abolition. That's where Frederick Douglass reached all the people he couldn't reach when he went, to Boston talking to a few people in a meeting house. The Black press has been crucial. A terrible shame. We can support participatory journalism. This is the idea. It's not citizen journalism where journalists go out, the citizens go out and amateurs go out and produce their own journalism. This is where community members work with professional journalists to help shape the news agenda and interpret stories together. So they're using new tech platforms with names like Harkin and Groundsource to text with people and consult with them in real time about, what do you think about this breaking news event? What angle do you think I should use to cover it? What sources should I talk to? They draw on community organizing techniques. I mean, old Cesar Chavez, White House meetings, relational interviews, getting to know you and figure out how you might contribute to my organization. We can work with organizations like Citizens Agenda, which solicit issues for election coverage and questions for candidates from communities. They train mainstream news organizations how to do this. This would really amplify the voice of the people in their lives. We can support solutions journalism. This is the idea that journalists shouldn't just report on problems, but also on potential solutions, preferably in the same article. That journalism has a duty to help us learn from innovative successes and failures. This isn't just happy talk news at the end of your 6:30 news show, right? Thank goodness the firefighters didn't get in the tree. Much more substantive. And it's not just free PR for whatever company came along and thinks it's solved, the world's problems with a widget. It counteracts the pervasive negativity bias in the news and public hopelessness and cynicism by searching for what works and how. It gives us some hope and well-grounded hope. So it enriches a number of these different functions of the news media. Here's some examples from the Solutions Journalism Network of some recent stories. It's just sober stuff, but it's just twitching that perspective and saying, rather than pointing out what doesn't work, what if we look for what does? And then to ensure that the next generation demands better news than we got and are getting, we really need to go back and strengthen civic education requirements and integrate journalism and news within our schooling. And we know from research that the old way in which many of us were probably taught civics is not the best way. The old way was pretty passive. We were taught to memorize facts and dates in US history and the different constitutional amendments. And that was pretty deadening for a lot of people. And research showed that it didn't inspire more people to participate in politics very much. That same research suggests that if we use active learning strategies, if we engage students, actually as we used to do in most public schools in this country in the 1930s, in respectful discussion of hard news and current events. This used to happen in high schools, even at the middle school level, all across the country in the 1930s. That can be a really important antidote to the toxic media culture that we're exposed to. If we engage young people in civic dialogue and deliberation with each other, learning how to disagree respectfully, learning how to work through differences and try to find common ground, that can be an antidote to the kind of toxic political culture that many of us experience. If we teach them news literacy, and actually some of the one more news that are particularly that news on social media than people our age. I hate to break that to us, but it's actually older people who are most likely to fall for fake news. That's not saying anybody in this room.
Of course.
That's. And we teach them to produce journalism in digital media, including the civic organizations and news organizations. This is going to be a really important investment in the future. To do this, just to wrap up, obviously we want to draw on a whole bunch of new sources of financing. In the old days, it was pretty much ads and audience subscriptions and memberships and a tiny slice of government subsidies in the United States. There are a lot of new financing arrangements, like news sharing arrangements. CalMatters, the incredible statewide news organization. We're very lucky in California to have a statewide news organization, CalMatters, which really filled the void in the loss of reporters at the State House in Sacramento. And they share their news with all sorts of news. Reveal, which is a fantastic investigative reporting outfit, run now out of the Berkeley School of Journalism. It used to be called Center for Investigative Reporting for many years. I did internship there in the early 90s, learning how to do investigative reporting. They use the same news sharing arrangement. Obviously, all these organizations have to operate across different platforms these days. That multi-platform operation, appealing to foundations, preferably ones that know how to keep their hands off of the news, but know how to fund it. Engaging journalism schools at universities in having student journalists contribute. And independent research centers like the Center for Public Integrity, or really to some extent ProPublica is one of these as well, right? I mean, independent in the sense they're independently funded. Yeah. And then news gathering association, from the old Associated Press to newer ones that are sprouting up all over the world that are willing to share news together. So that's what I have to share with you. Hopefully that last bit took the edge off the first bit. And got maybe with a few rays of sunshine and hope. Please let me know if you'd like me to take some questions.
So you covered this in some depth, but maybe you could summarize or clarify a little bit. Since the demand for local news is still there, and all of these organizations and the Rupert Murdochs of the world and so on who want to make money, why aren't they addressing this demand? Where's the conflict? Where's the disconnect? Why aren't they doing?
That's a good question. In a lot of these communities, it's considered not profitable enough, not just not profitable, but we could get a better return elsewhere if we were to found a news organization in a community with more people, in a news organization that has people with more money, who advertisers want to reach. The news media have never served audiences equally. I think they are particularly interested in people aged, in their prime spending years, whatever it is now, 18 to 55 or whatever, who are most likely to be interested in advertising products. So these are considered in many cases to be less profitable and not profitable enough if you get a better return investment.
You talk about the news deserts, but then you also did mention how Santa Fe Mercury is so much thinner. So my question is then, we don't live in a news desert, but we have not enough investigative reporters. And I know, for example, that our local weekly, Palo Alto Weekly, which they actually own 5 other papers, the Woodside Almanac, the Miami Voice, East Bay, etc. They are hurting. They're hurting badly, and they really want to turn it all into us all supporting. So what can we do to get those more money and more support, more investigators?
Some of those news organizations take donations. They have a kind of membership model where they appeal for funding. So that's something people feel comfortable giving to a for-profit organization to do that. Another thing we can do is encourage those news organizations to partner with organizations that can do this, which is typically expensive. Okay, which is typically expensive, right? More so than just reprinting a press release. Thanks so much. So for example, there was a story of East Palo Alto, on environmental justice in East Palo Alto. It was produced with high school students. It was a very good story. It was in the Menlo Park Almanac. These organizations could do more of that. They could find those partners, produce stories with them. The questions.
I have sort of an add-on and then a question. You showed Disney on there, and my grandson happens to write and edit for National Geographic. Disney bought them last year. Last week and this week, they have decimated the organization that my grandson writes for. He's doing science stories from all over the world. He's going to have printed for the first time next month. He has 2 on the way, and that's going to be gone. He gets to keep the 2 that he's going to be doing, but his managing director, anyway, they're gone. And that's because Disney only wanted what they do as far as media video. So my question is, what's happening with schools of journalism? Do they still exist? Are there less?
So in response to your anecdote, your story, obviously nonprofit news is the best cure, right? Nonprofit news organization with a public service mission is the best safeguard, right, against those kinds of cuts. Schools of journalism are absolutely innovating. I mean, they're terrified of losing students, right? Because students are not done. They realize that journalism is a difficult field to get a job in and get paid in. So schools like Columbia Journalism and Missouri and Berkeley are finding ways to partner with news organizations and create content and involve students. And some of the really good ones are teaching students this participatory and solutions journalism approach, so that they can go out and actually talk with real human beings and find out what they would like the journalists to cover and be more responsive and rebuild that trust. I think this is a time of real ferment and innovation within journalism.
So you opened your slideshow with a photo of George Santos and bemoaning that his constituents didn't know very much about him because it was just a small local paper that was covering this. I'm wondering why, big outlets like the New York Times or Washington Post don't assign reporters for like major congressional districts or all congressional districts, so that they can help us all understand more about these important politicians instead of depending on hit or miss local shootings.
So I think obviously one answer is money. It would be very expensive to send 435 journalists out there over the country. The Times, after Trump got elected, the Times did invest in more regional bureaus because they realized that they were being coastal elitists and they weren't listening to the rest of the country and they needed to find out what was going on. But the other thing is, if the New York Times had just read the North Shore leader, if they actually, because they used to, I mean, big news organizations used to read local news organizations and then follow up on that story, bring more research. So they fell asleep at the switch. It was actually that weekly that was offering good coverage, and if bigger organizations had just paid attention, that would have been great, right? And they could have amplified the story and gotten after and drawn more attention.
Or are they going to?
Well, I think some of them felt burned by that George Santos story. I think New York Times is going to be a little bit more attention.
Yes, thank you. A couple of thoughts to follow up on what Craig started in your response, and then first off, so Craig had asked about why aren't they covering? I think you mentioned it's not profitable. I think it's even more nefarious than that. If the corporations and the oligarchs that own much of the consolidated media, they don't fundamentally believe in democracy. They'd like to return us to feudalism, or the roots of this country, where white male wealthy property owners and slave owners had all the privilege powers. And they'd like to take us back to that. They don't want the working class voting. They don't want the working class to be in power. They want the working class back in chains. They want them to just shut up, accept what's happening and slide back into circle. So there's that. The second thing is, so you had mentioned maybe more diversity would be get more diversity in open the door. I don't think that's going to fix it either, in part because a lot of minority or Black, Hispanic, Asian immigrants and so on, they're completely seen out of politics. They're increasingly as the middle class disappears, they're sliding and they fall back into the queue with uncertainty. They don't have the time to get involved. I've been involved with activist politics for decades. And I can tell you, you go over to East San Jose and you go canvassing, knocking door to door. I mean, more than half of the people aren't even registered to vote. They don't have a clue about who the mayor is. And it's not that they don't care, it's just two things. They're very busy, they're working 2 or 3 jobs, and they don't have time to pay attention or read the newspaper. The second thing is they either they're consciously aware, or at least they have at least a nagging feeling somewhere inside that they are powerless, that their vote doesn't matter. Because unless you can pay to play, unless you can be one of the owner donors, you don't have any power in this country, especially in this post-Citizens United system that we have. So coming back to my point, I don't think that adversity. I think what will help us ultimately for the press and the center and the left in this country is class solidarity, organizing labor. And why so? Then this leads back to the question I'd like to ask you. What do you think about organized labor? What's left of organized labor? Getting behind publishing, because that's the only salvation.
Absolutely. And to be clear, that's one of the kinds of diversity I'm talking about, and that other people are talking about when you talk about the class background. And so I think there used to be a really vibrant labor media in the United States. In the 1930s, there were a whole network of radio stations that were run by labor unions. There was a labor press. I think rebuilding that media would be great. I think it's also important that there be labor reporters in a lot of these organizations, because they took the perspective of working people on stories that consumer reporters are not trained to take. If you send a consumer reporter to go cover a strike, they're going to focus exclusively on the inconveniences to consumers rather than politics, right? Why people are striking. So I would just say that there are some of the people who want to ask questions.
Yeah, I would like to ask.
My question is primarily technology oriented. We've seen a lot of changes in communication. A lot of large corporations. One time, and we can ensure that that's you. But now with AI coming, you don't know if it is me or not. You don't even know if you're you first. That was will help us.
That's a great question. I think local and national media and global media are all going to be struggling with how to develop technologies and use them that can spot AI deepfakes. And I think there are some that are, in development. I can't technologists that can't figure out how they work. But that's certainly something that people are looking at and trying to figure out. I think probably it wouldn't be an all bad thing for us to have a little bit more skepticism about images and not simply believe that that photo evidence is incontrovertible truth. Yeah. What they really want. And that's the media literacy work we need to learn, right? How to consult more than one source, how to avoid forwarding a story that looks too good to be true, probably isn't, right? Or that made us so angry, it must be true. Yeah.
be assured that truth exists, that it is.
One thing that seems to work pretty well, one thing that doesn't seem to work very well is fact checking by organizations that are already seen to be partisan. So like if CNN, publishes a fact check, everybody who's conservative and hasn't gotten picked yet for the fact that CNN is running for the center and for the right as fast as they can, is going to be like, oh, that's CNN, you can't trust it. One thing that seems to be working is preemptive, pre-bunking, not debunking a story that's already out there, but going out and pre-bunking it and saying, hey, there's this rumor going around, it's false. Right? And ideally from as many of the sources as possible. So if you can do that on social media, you can give out any service, pre-bunking something.
We have time for one more.
I just wondering about the recent flap with CNN and Trump and what a big scandal that provoked. But I'm thinking back to earlier days when local television actually had forums that were pretty good. And people participated and learned a lot, and it was a way of getting good information out and getting audience participation. I'm just wondering what the future of that might be like, what your thoughts are on it. I know that Spotlight, for instance, has sometimes can. The people do show up online. And it seems like, since the way I think I understand things is that most people still get their information over the television or the internet rather than reading newspapers. They're going on the side. And the visual presentations seems to be maybe an opportunity to try to do more of that community participation.
So I think, yeah, there used to be public service regulations that required private, broadcasters to air a certain amount of public affairs. Nowadays, I think we have to just look at the new media environment and ask people what media are people using. A lot of folks who don't have great access to expensive media like cable subscriptions are texting. Right? What you can get on your phone on a stripped down, cheap phone plan. So low tech sometimes is a better way to get those candidate comparisons up there. So I think we really need to start with the audience and say, where are they getting their information? Who's not getting it, and how can we make sure that we can reach them in a way that they, and we're going to do more translation. We're going to translate them better. Let's start with the audiences, figure out the channels they're using, WhatsApp or texting app. Let's get on there. Get in the